I wanted to share a few thoughts this morning about overcoming fear. And it is more important than ever that we start to help people have tools to address and identify their fear, because as the world gets more complex, as things deteriorate, as there's wars and rumors of wars, as there's all of these things in people's lives, increased anxiety, increased uncertainty. What the trouble with all of this boils down to is people are afraid. And being afraid is an emotional mindset. And if you are locked into the emotion of fear, you can't think clearly and make good decisions. And it's exceptionally important that we learn to quiet a fast emotional response and think things through in a logical and rational way so that we can make the best choices possible in a situation. And those choices are almost never immediately apparent, especially when you're flooded by a wave of fear and anxiety. So, in addition to being necessary in order to make the best long term decisions, you can't even get to the point where you can even start to think through those things until you start to recognize just how overcome currently you are by fear. So, what's a good example of this? Especially if you come from an explicitly religious place. And I mean, this is a channel where I talk about religion and spirituality. And so, uh, I am coming from that place specifically. These principles apply whether you believe in God or not. But for those of you that really do, or that say that you do, oftentimes believing in God and following Him and having faith in Him is presented as holding to a set of beliefs, no matter what evidence somebody presents to me that there's something better or that contradicts my beliefs. And you need to be able to identify the fact that if you have a belief that you think is solid, whether that's in God or in something God adjacent, like in a church or in uh, some belief of how you think reality actually is, and somebody challenges that belief with evidence, and you feel this like dissonance and you feel hurt inside or you feel scared, like this is actually just fear that your foundations are getting shaken. And the real solution to this problem is not to push away that feeling and say that I can never move my foundations. Because if you do that, you're sure to stay exactly as you are and never get any better, never get any closer to God, never find better things than you currently have. Instead, what you need to do is recognize that this is part of the process of becoming better. And you subsume that fear, or you let that fear be overwhelmed in the fear of the Lord. In other words, you make the Lord supreme in what you fear. And now I know this is already hard to hear for a lot of people because they don't want to think about God as something that you should fear. And ultimately, God isn't something that you should fear if you can love Him instead. But you don't get to loving God unless and until you first fear Him. So let me talk about some of these things. I have a couple of scriptures to share. Let's see. So first steps first. You need to take everything in your life, everything that you're nervous about, everything that you have fear of that you can't do, fear about your long-term eternal safety, fear about your temporal safety, and you need to remember that there is really one thing that is more supreme than anything else, and that is God. Now, this proverb I think states pretty clearly, in the fear of the Lord is strong confidence, and his children shall have a place of refuge. The fear of the Lord is a fountain of life to depart from the snares of death. So first things first, if you're looking for confidence, which is not quite the same thing as certainty, but it is actually what is more important and what is better than pure certainty, is confidence in the Lord, that you can trust him and that your trust of his ways are the optimal way for you to be, such that you can find a place of refuge. What does it mean to have refuge in this context? It means that you're able to withstand and overcome the hard things in reality that will continue to come. There is nothing in reality that you could suffer or go through that will destroy you or overcome you or send you down to the gulf of misery and endless woe, as the scriptures might say, because you have confidence in the Lord. And that confidence starts with fear. So the second verse, in verse 27, the fear of the Lord is a fountain of life. Like, how is fearing God a fountain of life? Now, fountain is a description of water. The Lord is described as the living water, saying that he has the living water to give. And anybody who comes and learns of him can become someone who has a fountain of living water or a fountain of life within them as well. And it starts with fearing him, fearing his ways, meaning following his ways, because you're more afraid of not doing that than you are of anything else. And that's why you can use the fear of the Lord to depart from the snares of death. What are the snares of death? Well, a snare is a trap that is laid for you, a trap that's laid by Satan, that is a less than optimal way of being, that if you believe and if you participate in, will ultimately lead to your death, both your temporal death and especially your spiritual death. Your lack or your inability, your the cessation of your progress in becoming more like the Lord and in it partaking in more of his joy that occurs with that becoming. So the very first way that you start is you subsume all your other fears to fear of the Lord. So you say, okay, I'm questioning some foundational beliefs about my life. I don't know if the way that I was raised is the correct way. And I feel all of this anxiety and fear because I don't know what my parents will think about that. I don't know what my friends will think about that. I don't know what my wife will think about that. I don't know about any of these things, right? This all happened with me as I was questioning my beliefs in my church. And what you have to do is take a step back and say, what's the number one thing that I'm actually afraid of? And it turns out that you're afraid of suffering, and you're afraid of both temporally and also eternally. And so what's the solution of that you already know if you're in a religious background? And that is that you follow the commandments of God, and that you don't seek for a way to be justified, if you will, in your continued sin or in your continued foolish ways, but you start to do everything that you know the Lord would do and has commanded you to do. And as you do that, that's what it means to depart from the snares of death. You step out of them by walking in the path of the Lord. So it leads to a progression of this overcoming fear. So you start in the way of death, you start there by default. Everybody is there. If you are knowingly doing anything that you know is wrong, anything that is less than the best that you could think of doing, anything where there's a clear better way to do something and you just decide to do something else instead, that's the way of death, because it's going to lead you to having less than you otherwise could. It's going to lead you to being a worse person than you otherwise would be. It's going to lead to worse outcomes for you and for your family and for everyone around you, more than you would if you were not doing that. This is the same thing as what's described as being wicked. It's not following the way of life, righteousness, how you actually believe God to be. the key with wickedness, when you read in the scriptures and you start to hear these descriptions of wickedness, is that wicked people don't know that they're wicked. Wicked people do not recognize themselves as wicked. Often they recognize themselves as righteous. Sometimes they think they're the most righteous people on earth. And this is because there's an inherent blindness that happens when you don't do the best that you know how to do. So until and unless something in reality happens to you that is so terrible that it shakes you out of this kind of sleepy mindset where you just think things are always going to be the way that they are, and you realize I don't have the tools to overcome these things that are overcoming me, you will probably stay stuck in this mindset. Now, that shaking can come in a number of different ways. It can happen through tragedy to self. It can happen to tragedy to people that you love. It can happen because of a person or a friend or a messenger from God comes to you and tells you all the things that you're doing that you don't see that are wrong, and they tell you those things. And if you respond to those things correctly, then you can enter into the way of life. Now, the Lord Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And that means a lot of things. But how is he the way? He is the ultimate way, the ultimate example of how to be in reality for the best possible outcomes that you could receive. He is the example and the result, the life that comes from living as he does. So he is the visible example of the best possible way of being, which leads to the best possible life. And he is the truth because he knows all of the ways to be in reality. The truth is things as they really are in reality, and the Lord lives in a way that is the best possible way anyone could live with respect to how things really are. And he knows everything about that. And he will teach you everything about that. And it starts from wherever you are if you make the decision to do the best that you know all the time from now on. You get there by fearing the Lord, like we talked about. You subsume all your current fears, all your uncertainties, you subsume to the fear of the Lord. There's 3 levels of this fear overcoming. There's 3 levels of states that overcome fear. Ultimately, it's overcome at the end. And if you want to think about it in terms of a progression, in the fear of the Lord, what you're really desiring is to avoid suffering. You're desiring self-preservation. And an honest person that truly just desires to avoid suffering will follow the Lord's way over any other way, because it actually is the way to avoid the most suffering. And it is the way to preserve yourself. So if for no other reason, you can fear the Lord's way and you can avoid as much suffering as is possible to avoid in this life, you can get rid of your unnecessary suffering. If you do that, you'll quickly be invited to learn greater levels of progression with the Lord, greater levels and higher resolution views of what the way of life is. So the fear, just doing what the Lord would do because you're afraid of the consequences of doing otherwise, that's a pretty low resolution way of looking at it, and the outcomes that you can have that way are limited. You move from fear to respect for the Lord. Okay? And this, instead of desiring to avoid suffering at this point, now you desire justice. And that includes what is deserved by all people. You desire for all people to get what they deserve, whether that's good or evil. And that includes yourself. So you don't desire to have more than you deserve. And you go out of your way to make sure that other people get what they deserve that is good. And you leave to God to make sure that people get what they deserve that is bad. We don't render to people negative justice, but we do restore people in positive justice if we can. So if you live that way, you now are in a completely different paradigm, and you'll be very different from the rest of the world. You're no longer seeking your own self-preservation. You're seeking what is deserved by all people, and it's very different. And the fear that can be overcome by living that way is a great amount indeed. Because if you truly live in a just way and you suffer massive injustice, by all rights, you can go to the Lord and say, Lord, I've been living justly. I've done everything that I can to help other people to receive what they deserve. And I've done all that I can in my life to receive something that's good and to do what's right. And I've been unjustly treated in this way, and I need your help. And the Lord will help people like that. God will help the just who have been treated unjustly. That's a promise that he gives to them. And so you can use that promise to both help yourself and to help other people. But there's an even higher level, which is where fear is ultimately finally overcome completely. And that is when you love the Lord and you have the love of the Lord. And this is not a desire just for justice. It's a desire for everyone to have as much as they possibly can, independent of the cost it gives you to yourself. So you are now willing to suffer anything if it helps someone to have more than they currently have, that being in a just way, right? So it's not about giving to people things they don't deserve necessarily. It's not about giving wicked people the fruits of being righteous, but it's about doing everything that you can to help other people go through these ways, to enter into the way of life so that they can start to fear the Lord and then respect the Lord and then love the Lord like yourself. And you can see that as you move through these 3 levels of progression, you go from wanting to not suffer, like to avoid as much suffering as possible, to being willing to suffer anything if it will help even a little bit. And when you do that, you actually are just like the Lord is in that regard. That is what Jesus did. He came down and suffered immensely more than anyone else has ever suffered, and did it for the possibility that we could all have more than we currently have, which is more of his joy by becoming more like him. So when you really think about that, that's where you start getting scriptures like in is it in 1 John 4, I think, that says that it's through perfect love that casteth out all fear. Because you don't have fear anymore when you love the Lord. In other words, you're not overcome by the thought of hardship. You're only concerned with the benefit and preservation and reducing of suffering of others as much as you can. And it completely changes the way that you think about everything in your life. So I invite you to think about ways in your life that you're afraid, to sit down in a calm place, write down what you're afraid, and try to get to the root of why you're afraid. And ultimately, you'll probably get to a place that says, I'm afraid of suffering, and here's the ways I'm afraid of suffering. And then you can begin to pray and ask the Lord to help you with that suffering and help you to know how to overcome it, and overcome first the fear of it and the anticipation of it, which is worse most times than actually going through it. You know, you can see this in very small ways. If anybody's ever had to give a presentation and they were really nervous about public speaking, it is always true that you're tormented and have anxiety, like before you give the presentation. Like, it's way worse than the actual presentation itself. And afterwards, you just feel massive relief. Okay, you can learn to bypass all that and just take things as they are. So I know that God wants to help everyone overcome their fear and to have confidence in him and trust in him. And I promise you that the fear of the Lord is like the source and the beginning of the fountain of life. So I hope this helps.